This whole question of what is misinformation, what is disinformation, is just so difficult to pin down. There is so much that is deeply contentious. That's why this is such a dire piece of legislation, and I hope that it will be ferociously opposed.
Australia is the greatest nation on earth. And at the referendum last year, Australians told the elites they want to keep it that way. Is 2024 the year mainstream Australians continue to secure our way of life, or will the elites strike back? In Season 3 of Australia's Future, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott will share his unique insight on the future of the Australian way of life. G'day Tony, and hello to all of our viewers and listeners. Great to be with you. Today, Tony and I will be discussing the escalation of conflict in the Middle East, Australia's economic situation, and the reintroduced misinformation online censorship laws. Tony, great to be with you.
And you, Dan.
All right, let's get straight into it with the biggest issue on the international stage at the moment, which is the escalation of conflict in the Middle East with Israel and Hezbollah. We've seen recently Israel engage in a series of strikes and taking out some key personnel from Hezbollah. It is also almost the anniversary of October 7 attacks on Israel. So this seems to be a new front in the conflict that's taking place, potentially leading to even greater hostility in the area. Tony, if you could give us an update of the situation, your assessment of what's happening there.
Dan, I think there are 2 points to make. The first point to make is that Israel is under existential threat from a series of apocalyptic death cults, and Israel is fighting what I believe is almost the epitome of a just war to defend itself. Mm-hmm. The second point to be made is that the attacks on Israel are really just a different branch of the attacks on Western civilization generally. We are in a fierce contest between the West and discontented revisionist powers. You've got the militarist dictatorship in Moscow, you've got the communist dictatorship in Beijing, and you've got the Islamist dictatorship in Tehran. And let's be under no illusions, whether it's Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, or indeed attacks directly from Iran on Israel, the Ayatollahs in Iran are masterminding all of this. It's pretty clear now that the reason for the October 7 attack last year, the anniversary of which is coming up, the reason for this was Iran wanted to torpedo the growing rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel because when it gets to the bottom of it, the Islamists in Tehran, they believe in a global caliphate. Mm-hmm. They regard Israel as the little Satan. They regard America as the great Satan. They are perfectly happy to see the world in flames because for them, the highest objective of life is not a good life, but martyrdom. Yeah. And this is the difficulty that we've got. We in these peaceful democracies such as Australia are confronted by implacable enemies who see the world very differently to us, and it's very hard for us to understand exactly how determined our opponents are. Now, the Chinese dictatorship, it's a party dictatorship, so it has a degree of rationality. The militarist dictatorship in Moscow, that's a personal dictatorship, so that's less predictable. The Islamist dictatorship in Tehran is probably the most dangerous in the short term because it follows a kind of a theology rather than a standard rationality. But nevertheless, all of these regimes are united only by their hatred of the West, are desperate to bring about change, a change which would be disastrous, not just for their immediate targets, Israel, Ukraine and Taiwan, but disastrous for free democracies all over the world.
So what is the end game here, Tony, do you think? I know that early on Netanyahu talked about wanting to basically wipe out Hezbollah. which, probably isn't possible because it's as much motivated by, as you said, like an idea and an ideology as it is people, but you can understand the sentiment that's there. And we've had talks of a ceasefire and so forth. I mean, how does this conflict end? Can it end? Or what's your sort of view on that?
Well, my view, Dan, is that you do have to aim for the destruction of Hamas, just as 70-odd years ago, the Western Allies aimed for the total destruction of Nazism. Now, Nazism was effectively destroyed, even though it was an idea. There was vast suffering, obviously, because there's a sense in which no one wins from wars. Nevertheless, while no one is better off from wars, in the end, they do make a difference. Sometimes a necessary difference. It was absolutely necessary that the Western Allies win the Second World War as a result of the completeness of their victory and the utter destruction of the German military. Nazism was effectively extinguished. And I think that it is possible by the scale of its defeat to effectively end Hamas. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm not saying that there won't be much suffering, but nevertheless, we have to appreciate just what these entities are. They are not political movements that you can compromise with. They're not even rational by our standards. They are dead set on the absolute destruction of Israel as the first step towards their version of the caliphate, Sharia law. The death to the infidel mindset is quite literal for these people, and that's why it's so important that Israel be given every assistance in what is a life and death struggle for Israel, but it's very important for all of us.
Yeah, and in terms of the Australian government response to this, I think it'd be fair to say it's been pretty lacklustre in terms of the support for Israel, and in terms of the, I guess, domestic reassurance to those, not just of a Jewish, I mean, a lot of the focus has been on the Jewish community, and obviously they're the most acutely affected by it, but it's really an Australian issue more than anything else. And it seems to me that they're, as I say, it's been lacklustre. There's obviously domestic political considerations that they're weighing up in that. Could you give us your view of how the Australian government has handled this and what your advice would be going forward?
Look, I regret that we have been so even-handed in all of this. I think it's disappointing, to put it at its kindest, that it took our Prime Minister a long, long time to get on the phone to Prime Minister Netanyahu in the aftermath of October the 7th, when our Foreign Minister Penny Wong finally bestirred herself to go to Israel. She couldn't visit the kibbutz that were at the heart of the atrocity. And just last week, when the Israelis conducted a brilliant pinpoint strike via the exploding pages and exploding walkie-talkies on Hamas's operatives, instead of congratulating the Israelis on being able to so specifically target enemy fighters, we had ministers in the government expressing their deep concerns and constantly calling for de-escalation. Well, you don't win wars by de-escalation. You win wars by identifying the enemy as precisely as you can and taking appropriate action against them. So really, this idea that we are in some way even-handed reminds me of Winston Churchill's famous statement back in the days of the 1926 general strike, "I refuse to be impartial as between the fire brigade and the fire."
Well, I think that's a good note to end on the international side of the equation, Tony. If we move on to the domestic front, we've got the economy, and obviously inflation is the key issue at the moment. We've just had the interest rate decision holding the cash rate at 5.35%, where it's been for almost a year now. Inflation figures just out show it's come down to 2.7% on an annual basis. But that's the headline figure that includes the cost of living relief, as the Governor of the Reserve Bank has made very clear. That's not the figure they're focused on. They're focused on a broader inflationary figure. And the Governor has basically said, look, don't get excited about an interest rate cut at any time. We want to see inflation firmly within the 2 to 3% band. I think Jim Chalmers, as Treasurer, has been too clever by half. It was quite smart of him, in a technocratic sense, to put in the energy bill relief to get that headline figure down. But the Governor of the RBA has said, look, we're not going to be pushed around by this accounting trickery. So it set up an interesting stage between the RBA and the government. Tony, very interested in your assessment of that situation.
Well, look, plainly it's a fiddle, basically. And the bank governor is right not to be taken in by all of this. And good on her for having the courage to stand up to what is effectively bullying by the government. Look, obviously inflation at these levels is a serious problem, and it does need to be brought down. But it's only one of a whole range of issues, and at the heart of our economic difficulty at the moment is that a whole range of government measures are actually forms of economic self-harm. You've got these union-friendly changes which are basically going to make it much harder for businesses to manage themselves with industry-wide bargaining and effectively industry-wide strikes, making it harder and harder to employ casual labour. This whole right to disconnect is basically just giving unions another stick with which to belabour employers. And what people need to remember is that no one can have a job unless there's someone there to give them a job, which is why every business has to make a profit. And every time you add to the business's cost, you're making it harder for the business to make a profit, and you're making it harder for the business to employ people. The other point that's got to be remembered is that in the end, governments can redistribute wealth, but they can't really create it. Wealth creation is something that is done by individuals and by businesses. And yet, wherever you look, this is a government which seems to want to push down on individuals. It wants to elevate government, minimise individuals. It's as if they every day want to create a weaker citizenry and a stronger government. We see it everywhere. I mean, the vast increases in green measures, the vast increases in climate measures, and all of this is making it so much harder to keep generating the wealth upon which the prosperity of all of us depends. I mean, this constant talk of making Australia a renewable energy superpower, as if no one else has sunshine, as if no one else has wind, as if somehow the sunshine in the middle of Australia can magically be converted to usable power all around the world. I mean, this is somewhere between a fantasy and a pipe dream and a boondoggle, and the actual industries that we've got, particularly coal and gas, two of our three biggest exports, are under constant challenge from this government. So the basic problem, sure, there's an argument between the Treasurer and the Reserve Bank Governor. Sure, in the short term, you've got the Reserve Bank putting its foot on the brake and the government putting its foot in the accelerator. But the much more basic and deeper problem is that this government's ideological preoccupations are damaging the fundamental strengths of our economy, and that's what we've got to get back to. We've got to get back to making it easier for the wealth creators to go about their business.
And something that we've talked about a couple of times, Tony, is this is a redistributionist government, not a growth government. It's a Whitlam government, not a Hawke government. The average annual growth rate under Hawke, I think, was 3.5%. Sometimes it was above 4%. In the government's latest budget, they've said the best you're going to get is growth in the twos, and that's with massive migration, whereas we know the per capita is going backwards.
Well, that's so important. And this helps to explain why so many people are feeling frustrated and disappointed, because they see the government boasting about economic success. They look at headline growth numbers that seem to be positive, if not particularly buoyant,
Yep.
and yet they don't feel like they're getting richer. And the truth is they're not. We've had 6 successive quarters of negative growth per capita. That means that individuals' wealth is going backwards, even as the country's wealth is notionally going forward. And that's because we've got about 500,000 people coming in every year at the moment. And the people coming in are not on average as productive as the people already here. And that's why all of us feel that we're going backwards right now. So this is serious. There is, to put it at its kindest, a pervasive sense of drift, and I find it very hard to see that things will change under this government. The only policy this government seems to have is, first, uncontrolled migration.
Yep.
Second, constant increases in government spending, and third, keep talking about green jobs, even though we know that installing solar panels is not a long-term, sustainable, well-paid job in the way that working on a gas rig or working as a coal miner is.
Oh, well, that's exactly right. And those policies you outline are all inflationary. So migration pumps up demand, spending pumps up demand, and then the energy system is pumping up costs and feeding that through the economy. So the marquee policies of this government are not only bad, they're also inflationary.
And you've got to say, looking at this government, that it's not very honest and not very competent. I mean, we know that the change to the stage 3 tax cuts was a clear broken promise. If, as is now reported, they're about to change the rules on negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount, that'll be another clear broken promise. So all of these changes are effectively increasing taxes, or certainly making taxes higher than they would otherwise have been, particularly on our most productive and entrepreneurial people, the wealth creators. And again, if you want an economy which is strengthening over time, if you want productivity which is going up in a sustained way, this is the last way to get it.
Well, I'd like to talk about another domestic issue which I think is of significant importance, which is the continued assault on freedom of speech with the proposed misinformation and disinformation laws. You'll remember earlier in the year the government had a first crack at trying to get those laws up. There was overwhelming community opposition. I think there was something like 2,000 submissions to that from ordinary people saying we don't want this. They've been reintroduced, some slight changes to the first bill, but not much. Michelle Rowland, who's the communications minister, says she wants this done by Christmas. They're only having a 1-week submission consultation period, which shows you their attitude to mainstream Australians and the normal democratic process. Look, there's a lot to talk about. In a nutshell, there's 3 key problems here. The first is that the government wants to empower a bureaucracy to define the truth. Secondly, it's unfair because politicians, government, academics and so forth are excluded, whereas ordinary people are included and can be censored. And third, it's a censorship first, ask questions later mentality, where social media companies will say, well, we don't want to get fined, so we're going to err on the side of censorship rather than risk these massive fines to our companies. So this is a enormous potential assault on mainstream Australians' right to express their opinions. I'm very interested in your perspective on this matter and why the government's pursuing it at this time.
It's yet another one of the many changes that would have been almost unthinkable just a decade ago, but which are now almost routine. So much about the contemporary West, particularly the contemporary Anglosphere, is at odds with what was taken for granted just a couple of decades back. And this latest assault on free speech is of a piece with all of that. Look, this whole question of what is misinformation, what is disinformation, is just so difficult to pin down.
Yep.
For instance, was the Prime Minister's claim during the election that he would reduce power bills by $275 per household per year, was that misinformation, an honest mistake, if you like, or was it disinformation, a deliberate untruth? The claims during the pandemic that masks were essentially useless, was that misinformation? And then what about the claims that masks were essentially necessary? Was that misinformation? Because as we saw during the pandemic, what the science said, the so-called science said, changed from week to week and from place to place. What about questions to do with climate, for instance? Now, you listen to a very respected climate scientist like Richard Lindzen, formerly of Harvard University, who's deeply sceptical about the man-made global warming thesis. Is that misinformation? Is that disinformation? I'm sure there'd be lots of people in the Albanese government who would say that that was either mis or disinformation, and yet this is the opinion of an extremely well-respected, multiply awarded climate scientist. So there is so much that is deeply contentious, and yet there is so much that the cultural commissars, the climate commissars, the gender commissars and others would want to cancel. That's why this is such a really dire piece of legislation, and I hope that it will be ferociously opposed by good people in the Parliament, and if by some mischance it does get rammed through the Parliament with the government and the Greens doing their worst, I hope that there'll be people who will commit to saying that should there be a change of government, this will be one of the first things repealed. I mean, if there is to be a change of government, there is an absolute mountain of legislation that the current government has passed that really must be repealed as the first order of business.
Well, I think the coalition looks like it will oppose these laws based on what I've seen so far. They oppose the last tranche. I don't see how you could support this having opposed the last tranche, because these are basically the same. There's not many differences. I guess this other point, speaking of misinformation, when the Prime Minister said, the voice to Parliament is just a modest change. It's just a modest little tinkering to the Constitution. So I think it's fundamentally being used to...
And the point that was made back then was the Uluru Statement, 1 page or 26 pages. Now, plainly, the Uluru Statement had a one-page version, the high-sounding, as it were, executive summary, and then there was the full document, which was 26 pages of grievance and demands for reparations. Now, if we have a misinformation and disinformation bill passed into law, presumably it'll be harder than ever to get the social media companies to allow these sorts of discussions to take place, because they'll be even more frightened than they currently are of the bureaucratic censors breathing down their neck and imposing terrible fines on them. Look, I accept, Dan, that the online world is a bit of a Wild West, and I certainly would like to see it tamed. By far the best way to do this, I believe, would be to ensure that no one can create an online identity that is not traceable by the right authorities back to a real live person. I mean, you and I can't be anonymous as we walk down the street. You and I can't be anonymous if we want to get on a plane or open a bank account. If we want to get a letter published in the newspaper, we can't be anonymous. Why should we be anonymous online, hiding behind some bizarre handle or other? And I think that's the reform that people should be focused on if they want to clean up the online world rather than trying to suppress opinions that they don't agree with.
Yeah, I think there's also the related matter of the kind of content that children are exposed to and their access to the online world. And quite often the misinformation laws are deliberately conflated with what is a genuine issue of what children are exposed to, and you have the E-Safety Commissioner who's engaging in political crusades rather than actually sticking to the remit.
Exactly, and look, just as we don't allow people under 18 to go into a pub, we don't allow people under 17 to drive a car, we don't allow cigarettes to be sold to people under 16. I think there's a very good case for saying that people under 16 shouldn't be allowed on social media. My kids, I'm pleased to say, escaped the mass exposure to social media, which is a risk now, but I'm sure you'll be a highly responsible parent, Dan, and your kids won't be given internet-connected devices
for as long as possible.
Until they're old enough to use them maturely.
Till they're 40, I think. It does raise an interesting issue, though, because I think the first port of call is parental responsibility, and I think there's a tendency sometimes to try and fob things off to government and say, well, you've got to do this. I think that's fair when your kids are young, but as they get into sort of the early teens, and that's where a lot of the challenges are, particularly for young girls, we know, from sort of, let's say, 10 to 15, there's only so much you can do, and I think, But
again, Dan, I mean, this is where parents have got to be responsible adults, and let's face it, the parents are usually paying for these things, and so I think the parents should be strong enough to say, look, you can get a dumb phone, but you can't get a smartphone. And the schools have got to be strong too. I mean, the schools have got to say, look, you hand your phone in when you turn up at 8:30 in the morning, and it stays in a locked box until you leave at 3 or 3:30 in the afternoon. You can't play with it during school hours. And again, the horror for so many youngsters, because of the way so many have been sucked into this online vortex, is if they're being bullied, and we all know bullying is a problem for teenagers. It probably has been since the beginning of time. But once upon a time, the bullying stopped when you left the schoolyard. Now it follows you home thanks to your device and the social media stuff. So there's a lot to be done, but we're not going to do it by having Big Brother government pass a law decreeing that things it doesn't approve of can't be said.
Just to round out the conversation, I think that this issue, particularly of young people and social media and the whole online world, is a fairly complicated issue. And it almost feels to me that it's beyond the capacity of our political system to have a proper debate. We need to actually have a debate about this over many years to figure out the right public policy response. And then basically you get these sound bites from politicians and no one really is delving. I mean, there's people in the civil society sphere, Jonathan Haidt and others have thought about this seriously, but it almost feels like when you think about the massive reforms we had, economic reforms, that took many, many years to take place, and there was intellectuals involved, there was the news organisations, and we had a proper debate. It almost, to me, feels like we don't really have a proper debate or consideration of these issues. It's just the politics of it, and people move on to the next thing. Are we as a country almost beyond the capacity now to fully think through these complicated issues? What do you reckon?
Well, I fear that our attention spans are shorter and shorter. I think that's a serious problem. I also think that our public life is shallower and shallower. One of the things that staggered me about the whole governmental response to the pandemic was that at no stage did any person in authority, I'm talking about a premier or a prime minister or a president, give us a thoughtful and considered exposition of exactly what he or she was trying to do. Now, when I was a minister in a government, or indeed a party leader, on all the important issues, I tried to make it my practice to, from time to time, give a serious, considered, scripted speech, a 2,000 or 3,000 word exposition on the topic. Now, I don't want to say that this was the last word in wisdom, but it's really only if you subject yourself to the discipline of putting things down on paper at length that you really start to look at all of the pros and cons, the ups, the downs, the highways and the byways of these issues. And you're right, Dan, so often what you get are not considered responses, but performative announcements, which are designed to look like you're doing something as opposed to actually doing something to address these problems. And this is at the heart of the increasing public frustration. We elect governments, but nothing much seems to change because in the end, so much of what happens is the unelected and unaccountable public service on autopilot.
Well, Tony, I think on that note, we'll close it off for today. So as always, thanks for your time and your insights, and looking forward to our next chat.
Me too, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.